So a few years ago, I received my first ever 3D printer as a gift for Christmas. It was a Monoprice Select Mini V2. For a while this was my main printer, but eventually it started to need some maintenance, and I felt that it was missing a bit of build volume. So instead of doing this maintenance, I purchased an Ender 3 Pro on sale. This was it printing its first model around 3 years ago. Since then, I've upgraded this printer so much that it prints pretty much as well as some way more expensive printers, and there aren't any original parts left except for the motion platform. I've upgraded the mainboard to an SKR Mini, changed all of the fans over to Noctua fans, and put a PC fan on the power supply. I've added an all-metal hot end for printing high-temp materials. I've changed the bed surface, the extruder, the main screen, and I've added a BL Touch. So with all these upgrades, this Ender 3 has really become my workhorse, and the Mini was relegated to sitting on a shelf unused for a few years. Although recently, with me printing so much for this channel, and in the future here I'm going to be printing a whole bunch to make my girlfriend's electric skateboard, I started to wonder, what if I went back and restored my original printer to working order? Because then I could have two printers going at the same time! To understand why I need to restore the printer before using it, take a listen to the sounds that the axes make, especially the Y-axis. Ugh, so gross. It's also noteworthy to mention some of the other issues that the printer has, such as it currently has no fans. So I took these fans off this printer and put them on my Ender 3 since I had previously upgraded it with Noctua fans. And not to mention that this printer does not even have a print cooling fan in its stock configuration, which can make printing overhangs pretty difficult. Also, the hot end thermistor is able to just fall out. And I don't believe that this printer has any thermal runaway protection, so that's just a little sketchy for my liking. The Y-axis belt is too short, and the tensioner that I tried to make a few years ago doesn't really work very well, so I want to fix this too. And speaking of tensioners, this printer doesn't really have any. It just uses these weird little spring things on the belt, and it doesn't really work that well with the belt being pretty loose. It's missing a foot, so it doesn't really sit flat on the table. The onboard USB port is wrecked. Not that I can really fix that, but it's just an observation. The front display casing is half melted, so I'd like to make that a little less ugly. And finally, there is no spool holder. I have no idea where it went, but I'm going to have to make a new one. So as a side note, I want to do this as cheap as possible, since really if I spend more than $100, I may as well buy another more capable printer from Amazon. Luckily though, a lot of the parts that I need can either be printed on my Ender 3, or I already have them in my box of random crap. So the first step is to disassemble the printer, see what parts I need to order, what parts I have, and what parts need to be replaced. I started out by removing the glass bed and removing the fan shroud from the extruder. Then I flipped the printer over and got ready to take the bottom panel off. Using the power of my drill, I was able to quickly remove all the screws from the bottom, and I went along and unplugged everything from the mainboard. With the bottom panel out of the way, I started to remove a bunch of the screws that hold the Z-axis and X-axis assembly on. So with the front and back panel removed, I went through and I unplugged all of the wires to the motors and to the extruder. Then I removed the X and Z axis tower off of the base of the printer. This required me to hand unscrew the Z axis rod out of the assembly, which took a hot minute. So next I started to take apart the Y axis from the printer, which was the one I was the most concerned about. It had the most problems, so this should be interesting. So since I wanted to redesign the print head, I had to take apart the X-axis assembly. So this involved removing the block at the end of the axis that held the idler pulley on. And so initially I tried just pulling, which didn't work. So then I tried to heat it up with a soldering iron in order to remove the pulley, which also didn't really work. So keeping with the theme of heat, I tried using a lighter to heat up the rods this time, apparently off camera, and then I whacked it with a screwdriver and I was able to get the end piece off. This then allowed me to remove the remaining part of the X-axis carriage. So now the printer was disassembled as much as I needed it to be. I started to take a look at the parts and see what I needed to replace. So the first thing I took a look at was the hot end. So I took the heating block and the coupler off. I replaced the coupler and took a look at the lining. Seemed like it was in pretty good shape, so I think I'll be able to reuse this part. So using some paper towel and rubbing alcohol, I wiped off all of the linear rods and took a look. So both the X-axis and Z-axis rods looked pretty good, but when I took a look at the Y-axis rods, I noticed that along both rods there was some significant scratching and pitting. This would definitely need to be cleaned up before I could use them again. And this was probably also contributing to that rough motion that we were experiencing on the Y-axis. So next I took a look at the build plate and was specifically wanting to look at the length of the Y-axis belt. And this was going to determine on whether I needed to order belts or not. So once I actually took the belt off, it was actually probably long enough, but it was damaged near the end, so I decided to order belts anyways. So, luckily, with my fairly short parts list of fans and belts, I filled up a container with rubbing alcohol and placed the Y and X axis bearings in, and then I left them while I waited for the parts to arrive. So I ordered some pretty high quality Big Tree Tech belts and some fairly high RPM 12 volt fans. The total came to around $30, so not too bad for the price of a whole new printer. So even though I was waiting for those to come in, I still had some stuff I could do. So I downloaded this CAD model of the printer. This ended up being super useful, so big shout out to the Thingiverse maker here who designed this. And I imported it into SolidWorks and got to work designing a new hot end mount. So my goal for this was to keep it simple, keep the same nozzle offsets because this printer doesn't have a very complicated Marlin interface, and design it so that I could have a part cooling fan. So this is what I ended up coming up with. It's a fairly simple design. It uses two 40mm fans, and then I used the space that was essentially wasted in the original design as a duct for the air to pass to the nozzle. And then I made a simple tensioner that goes on the end of the rods. You just tension it with your hand, not with a screw. It's not a big deal to me. I think it works just fine. Once these were done, I started printing them out on my Ender 3 out of black ABS and got to work on some more physical stuff on the printer. So first thing to do was to disassemble that little front panel cover. This ended up being a little bit annoying, but came apart pretty easily. So the next thing after that was to steal some stepper motor dampers from my Ender 3 and install them on the X and Y axis of the Monoprice. Then I also installed a secondhand beautiful red extruder that was just a little bit higher quality than the one that was on the printer to begin with. Then I polished up the Y-axis rods to hopefully get rid of some of those grooves. So I used a pretty fine emery cloth to start, and then I used some toothpaste on a microfiber cloth to sort of finish off the polish. So these honestly ended up looking really great. There was still definitely some slight grooves, but a lot of the major scratches were gone now. Next, I drilled some holes to move the Z-axis end stop a little bit up to accommodate the glass bed. Then I added an M3 screw to hold the glass bead thermistor in so that it hopefully wouldn't fall out when printing. I then spent some time with the syringe and really shot out the bearings to try to get a lot of the chunks out. This left me with some really nice looking alcohol. And by the time I was done this, I had some parts coming off the printer. So I had the new faceplate, so I went ahead and installed that. I also had all of the parts for the new hot end mount and belt tensioning system. So I got to work installing those on the X-axis. So once I finished that, it moved pretty freely, and I moved on to the Y-axis. I actually had a tiny amount of belt that I was going to be able to use, so I got to work installing that onto the bottom of the bed. Once that was done, I installed both a belt tensioner on the front, and then I installed the bed onto the printer itself. And with all of my changes, it sounded and felt significantly better to move the Y-axis. So after waiting a whole 2 weeks, the parts arrived. So I was able to continue and finish off the rest of the printer. So this video is getting a little long and this isn't that interesting, so I'll go through the final stuff in rapid succession. I installed some TL smoothers on the X and Y axis. Cut my finger really bad while I was installing new feet. Put a band-aid on my finger and then drilled and installed new feet to the bottom. Finished off the X-axis with fans and belt. And then I rebuilt the printer. I will spare you that whole mess. I then installed a little bit of beautiful blue Capricorn tubing between the extruder and the hot end. And this spool mount, which I absolutely hated and redesigned myself. And then I went to start the first print and it took way too long to heat up, so I decided I was going to mod in an Xbox One power supply. In theory, this should give it a ton of headroom on the amperage, but in practice, I completely wasted my time. It still heats up extremely slow. But now it was actually ready for its first print, so I quickly leveled the bed and started, well, you guessed it, a benchy. So while printing, it was honestly a lot quieter than I thought it would be. I remember it being an extremely loud printer back in the day, but I guess that those stepper motor dampers really help. The loudest thing currently was actually the high RPM fans that I bought, so I decided I was going to fix that later. But overall, the benchy that it produced looked absolutely great. So in red is a benchy from my Ender 3, and in blue is the benchy from the Monoprice. And honestly, it looked incredible. Now you have to keep in mind that the Monoprice was using a 0.4mm nozzle, and my Ender 3 uses a 0.6mm nozzle with Arachne slicing. And the layer height on the Ender was set to 2 times the layer height on the Monoprice. But overall, honestly, it looks pretty incredible. The extrusion looks good, the print cooling looks really good, and overall pretty much a 9 out of 10 benchy. And the final sort of cherry on the top things to do was I stole the Noctua fan off the hot end of my Ender and put it in the case, and I added a buck converter so that I could undervolt the hot end cooling fan and the part cooling fan a little bit. So setting them to 10 volts made them significantly quieter and didn't seem to affect the part quality at all. And the last thing that I did was print out and install my own design for a spool mount, which I think looks a lot better. And yeah, the printer was complete. So for around 30 bucks, I have a perfectly capable TPU and PLA machine that is going to be extremely useful on the channel in the future here. It actually prints TPU significantly better than my Ender 3, which has problems with the TPU sticking to the hot end. So thank you so much for watching. This was a really fun video to make. It's really awesome to be able to revive this printer from basically being dead. So hopefully I'm going to have part 3, the final part of the electric skateboard out soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.